Lovely for you all to join us. My name's Anthony Wilson. You know that because it says that on the bottom of my screen. I'm the Director of Culture and Leadership here at U Collective, and I'm really delighted to be joined by Helen Attia-Tolkien, workplace strategist, for this conversation around about shifting cultures with intention. This is a topic that I'm hugely passionate about, and Helen, you and I have been talking about this for some time. So before we dive into that, in the words of Jim Bowen, for those of you who get that reference, what's your name and where do you come from?
Yeah, and we just had a conversation about UK and northernness. So I'm really delighted to be here. Just want to say love the work that the U Collective do. So thank you for having me. Helen Attie-Tolkien. I from the UK, live in the Netherlands. I'm in Amsterdam right now. And at the moment, I'm working at Cadence, focused on the future of work, and all the changes that have happened and are happening around ways of working, optimizing that for organizations, big and small. This topic's very personal and fascinating for me because I've been through quite a bit of change over my career. I have always worked in tech, but for very small and very large organizations and everything in between. So startup to scale up to big corporate. So excited to get into this with everybody.
Brilliant. So before we dive into this full on, those of you who are watching, we really want to hear your questions. I've got plenty of questions in the background ready, but if you get your questions either using the question function or in the chat room, and I'll make sure that we either weave it into our conversation or we'll answer it certainly at the end. So Helen, I guess to start off with, you told us a bit about your background. I think one of the things that I was really fascinated about when we first started talking was the very fact that you have such a huge focus on culture and people, but you aren't necessarily in a people and culture function. I wonder if you could just tell us a bit more about that and why you think that's important.
Yeah, I have always worked in commercial roles.
Mm.
Mainly sales, started out as an individual contributor, did some marketing, customer experience, and then moved into sales and customer experience leadership. And I just have seen all the way through how the team come together is the biggest difference between whether we're going to be successful or not as a team. I felt very early on that culture was something paramount. Um, in the early days, perhaps didn't really feel like I understood it. I perhaps wasn't identifying that this was what it was that was going on in those higher performing organizations and teams that I was experiencing, working with and then leading. Um, so I more recently, I'm just, super clear that what we're talking about today isn't only the responsibility of one function. It cannot be. And I feel fortunate these days that it's something that is, paramount to me as I look at the organizations I want to partner with and work for. Do the leadership get that, right? That it's our responsibility collectively as leaders to really understand what culture is in these organizations, to build it, to protect it. For me, those organizations that don't get that cannot build sustainable, great businesses or organizations. So yeah, it's everybody's responsibility. And I think we'll get into this. It isn't just the responsibility of leaders either. It's all of us. How do we create organizations where every employee feels a part of something and a part of the culture?
Yeah, agreed. And I think that's one of the things I always hold on to is that, if we think, culture is the collective mindset of everybody within the organization, it's a collective of all of their values, behaviors, motivations, backgrounds, etc. And
Yeah.
whereas you were speaking there, and it's what I'd like to explore next is that quite often leadership will claim responsibility for building a wonderful culture when everything's going well, and and they're on off
Yeah.
sites, and there's they're away on an away day, or the company retreat or something like that. But when things get difficult, it becomes HR and the people functions responsibility.
Yeah.
Um, so when you see organizations, and I'd like to do this kind of up and down, when you see organizations going through those various stages of growth, so from kind of startup, scale up, large business, sort of into corporate, um, what do you see as being the most common mistakes that are made along those stages?
Yeah. So I'm just smiling because I have experienced this one. I'm going to share quite a lot, and it doesn't matter the size. So as I said, I've always worked in tech, primarily tech startups, but a few that have done pretty well and been acquired by the biggies. So I worked for Oracle for a while and
Hmm.
for Adobe as well. So two of the biggest tech companies in the world. Um, and I've seen this everywhere, that hiring great people who get it
Hmm.
mean our culture will be great, right? Just hire good people, they'll get it.
Yeah.
Don't worry about culture, just hire the right people. Um, and without the clarity of what we mean by, that they get it,
Hmm.
uh, we're talking about a talent strategy, right? Hire good people, but culture is something different. So I think that sort of expectation of yeah, good people coming together will create something great on its own. For a while, yeah, maybe. But that needs operationalizing, and everybody needs to understand what it is that together we're creating.
Yeah, there's a question come up which is really pertinent to that in the chat function that Scott asks. Thanks, Scott. How do you create and curate culture that develops alongside the company's changing workforce and avoids the one of us syndrome? So you just sort of touched on that a little bit. This
Mm.
difference between culture fit and culture add. So how do you bring that into play as you're growing and as part of that kind of talent strategy?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, and again, I'm not a people leader. I don't have an HR background. I'm really passionate about trying to define what this thing is that we come together and start to feel and that we like, um, and that brings us together and makes us want to keep working together. Um, I so there's three things that I wanted to share. I think they're probably worth sharing at this point, given Scott's question. So I'm working a lot, as I said, in kind of ways of working change. So an organization going from, for example, like largely remote to back in the office a bit more, or maybe moving to sort of digital first, remote first, and that's a change like any other. So I feel like some of the things I'm experiencing are worth sharing here. And the first thing that I note is like defining clearly the purpose that we're trying to get to out the other side of the change, like is just paramount. So I mean, clarity is an obvious thing, but it's amazing how much we forget to just be really clear with everybody about why the change is happening. So in this case, why are we asking people to come into the office 3 days a week, for example? And then holding uh, everybody accountable. And it's interesting, like leadership needs to continue to be clear with everybody and reinforce the kind of purpose and the message. But I think then, hopefully we're all adults in an organization. I've seen it really work where we try and have all levels of the organization feel some level of accountability for the change, or perhaps to Scott's question, for this culture that we're trying to create together. Because culture isn't something that one person can own, to your point, Scott. It has to be something that we're co-creating and continuing to co-create. And I don't know if you guys are going to link some of the resources that I
Yeah.
shared when we are having a conversation, but there's a guy I'm kind of obsessed with at the moment, Brian Elliott, who talks about, so he worked for Google and for Slack, both early on, and he talks about how they created that early culture. And one of the tools that he uses is something called team level agreements. And the idea of it sounds a little complex, but really all it is a team coming together to do exactly this co-creation of the culture that matters to them. So in the work I do, when we're thinking about, for example, a move to a 3 day a week hybrid policy, and that change, it's been set top down, but how do we as a
Yeah.
team agree what matters to us? And so, all right, maybe one of those 3 days we're going to come together in the office. And as a team, we need to agree that, right? And then maybe there's another moment in the week that we are going to agree that we're there to support each other. So we're always available, whatever it is, and it's going to be different for every team. So I think that team level agreement, or at least that focus within a team of taking what has been hopefully made clear and then is kind of owned within the team is really important. Um, the third thing that I also think is like often forgotten, but pretty simple too, is the comms that needs to happen. Like it feels so basic, but it's amazing how when change happens and things get a bit hard, like people freeze. And just even being able to acknowledge that, you know, we're not even sure what we're saying right now, but we're bringing you together because a change is happening and this is hard, and we want you to all feel like we recognize that and we acknowledge it. And an example I had actually going through one of the acquisitions that I went through was actually exactly that, I was with a relatively small business and we were being acquired by a very large business, and we didn't know, who was going to keep their jobs, what jobs we were going to be doing, when we were going to be fully integrated. There were so many questions, and our leaders for quite some time didn't have the answers to those questions, but they kept bringing us together to say,
Yeah.
sorry guys, we don't know yet, but we're in this together and we're bringing you through the change together.
Yeah, I'm just going to reiterate those points because I think they're so important to land on, like, because the clarity of purpose, whether that be change, whether that it be the reason that we're coming in every day is hugely important. It gives some people something to unify behind, holding each other accountable. So if we're going to have a set of values and behaviors that we sign up for, that has to be for everyone. And how do we
Yeah,
create, and we'll talk about systems and processes in a bit, but how do we create a kind of system and process that allow us to hold each other to accountable? And I think that bit about translation is really important because it feeds into the comms piece. Because quite often when we do work around articulating culture, the purpose, values, behaviors, competencies, a lot of organizations see that as a one and done. So there we go, we've
mm,
got that now.
yeah,
But like with any of things, like marketing, tell people what you're going to tell them what you need to tell them what you told them, and then tell them again. And
yeah,
you need to allow people to understand how that purpose and values relates to their specific role, their specific context,
yeah.
and even more broadly than that, how they connect their own values and behaviors with those of the organization to create some kind of alignment.
Yeah, 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 yeah. And I think I've experienced too that leaders feel like, oh, we've already, yeah, just as you're saying, we've already said that.
Yeah.
Like, are there any other ways that we can say the same thing differently? No. Um, but it is remarkable what and actually it isn't that surprising if you think about it. Like, we were chatting about this earlier, Anthony, like the sign of a good relationship, any good relationship, is being able to communicate well with each other, openly and honestly, hopefully, but at least regular communication. And so I think it's the least that, as an employee, we can expect from leaders. And again, I think it doesn't always have to fall to leadership. So if we can, or I mean, sort of senior leadership, like if we can create these structures, and this is to that sort of operationalizing point, where there is regular communication in our smaller teams, and I love the concept of a change champion. So
Hmm.
those folks, that aren't necessarily in a particular team or at a particular seniority level, but they just and I'm contradicting myself a bit from earlier. They just get it, or they at least they feel bought in and that they want to be part of a change. And maybe, earlier on in my career, I would have loved to have been a change champion, but a lot of my experience was, well, they were all in the people team. And so I just need to wait for a message to come from the people team, and then I can try and do a good job of kind of communicating with the folks around me about how we all feel about that. But maybe, if there had been a few of us dotted around, getting feedback, passing that up, things that could have been different.
Yeah, and if it's all right, we've had a few questions that are useful for us to pull at some of those red threads before we will come on to the idea around operationalizing culture in a second when I can say it. But so Sophie asks, as a comms manager, what are some of those key points for those? And it's funny, isn't it? Like we're talking about culture now, but I think almost all of my conversations about culture with clients at the moment are actually around change, and we sort of framed that around that. So,
Mm.
what are some of your key points that you'd be highlighting?
Well, we've probably all like a little bit. I don't know. So my experience is we have a comms channel. We use Slack, and we have all hands meetings. And I think there's messages that go out at all hands, and then there's messages that go out through the comms channels
Mhm.
and through Slack. Um, I think that the regularity is one of the key things. Is just keep that drumbeat of those messages, and so maybe we're talking about kind of two things here: the drumbeat of the change. So being intentional about the regularity of communications, full stop. So through those channels that you already have in place. And then I think that the point for me that's really important is this taking it from that broad announcement style to conversation.
Yeah.
And as much, and if we can create as many of those conversation moments, the better, because then that's where you get the real kind of juice of it, right? Like, what do people really think? And I've experienced lots of these sort of open forums. Tell us what you think, right? On an all hands
Mm.
or even like office hours, leaders doing an open office hours. Come on, and these days it's usually over Zoom, right? Like, tell us what you think. But that's pretty difficult for people to do. And maybe it's the same group of people that will feel comfortable sharing their opinion in that forum. And what you really need are those places where people feel they can have conversation and do it safely in that safe space. So that's why for me that getting it down into at a team level, and then ideally even outside of the team, but with these sort of change champions and other folks, it makes that more likely. You're more likely to get that real feedback.
I think that's really striking, isn't it? Because often when we think about comms, particularly when we think about change comms, whether that be in growth or we'll touch on degrowth in a second, it becomes broadcast. Whereas actually,
Yeah.
as one of my people probably can't read it, one of my favorite quotes is by Paulina Oliveros, which is how you listen is how you create culture. So actually creating that space for leaders to listen, for managers to listen, um, to get a sense of the mood music, but also get a sense of when we mentioned this in our pre-chat, to be able to understand at those various different stages and give value to the emotions that are involved in change,
Yeah.
rather than this is why we're doing the change, crack on with it, and yeah, we'll see you when it's worked or not worked, kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And I love that sense of and there's a quote from someone, I can dig it out, um, that acknowledgement creates space. So just acknowledging, like just
Mhm.
that, and that's part of listening here, but like just acknowledging what's here. Um, and that takes courage, right? Like it's much easier for some leaders than it is for others. And I think depending on the change that the organization's going through, it's so important that leadership can identify, okay, who are the leaders that you know, we're gonna perhaps lean on right now. It doesn't have to be the responsibility of any one person. If there are certain skills that certain leaders have in a leadership team, and we put those people forward that feel perhaps more comfortable kind of hosting quite a difficult conversation. But yeah, just the acknowledgement creates space, and then There's fear, but there's also opportunity, right? Like I mean, I'm thinking about acquisition. Um, Often lots of fear when an acquisition's looming.
Mm.
But of course, also, or even growth, right? I mean, I've worked for businesses that have grown really fast, and some people are like, oh, wow, like there's such opportunity with this growth. I'm so excited about it. And others are absolutely terrified because things are constantly changing and they can't quite get a hold of anything. There's just so much change. So I think just, yeah, being able to, as a leader, hold those two things, fear,
Yeah.
opportunity, and keep reminding people that, you know, it's scary, but there is some good stuff here. Let's see how we can focus on that and build on it.
And I think, and I guess because we've been talking, one of the, I did want to, we sort of talked about, what happens to culture and how we can avoid the pitfalls as we grow. And you just mentioned it there, sort of touched on it there. What about degrowth, either in downsizing? And interesting, I think we were talking before we came on, that can either be there's a need to downsize or restructure. So what are the pitfalls around culture then? They may be the same ones as I'm saying out loud, but also the kind of dichotomy of or the oxymoron of merger and acquisition, where you can be both be growing and downsizing at the same time. You're growing as a business because you've gained new investment, you've been brought under
Yeah,
into a conglomerate, but then parts of the business may be being restructured, downsized, centralized, whatever. What
yeah,
are some of your thoughts around that?
yeah. I mean, I would just say, like, double down on it, double down on the things that we talked about, clarity, accountability, comms. You know, it's the worst thing when, and I actually experienced it. I joined an organization that was acquired by a big one, and I moved. I lived in Asia for a while. I lived in Singapore, and I was part of the kind of the startup that had been acquired. And in that part of the world, there wasn't a lot of that technology, that product that
Hmm.
we were selling. And so we were like this kind of tiny thing, but the new shiny thing within this older, very established team had been together forever, part of the organization. And there was so much going on there. Like it was fear, downsizing of the stuff that had been there for a really long time, growth of this shiny new thing, people feeling like, oh my goodness, I can't do that new thing. I don't have the experience. There's this new culture. It was just really complex. But what the leaders, well, that time did, I think, really well is they kept bringing people physically together. So there was communication going on a lot, and there was conversation about like how are we going to bring shared meaning.
Hmm.
There is a place for these two things, but we've got to find it together. So I think that idea of like we're not just merging, but we're going to try and share some meaning here together is just
Mm.
again really important. And not all leaders will find that a comfortable place to be. But my experience in that example was it was really powerful because and it meant we could get to know each other as well, these two very different groups of people, and learn from each other. Of course there were things we could learn from each other, and so we had regular time to do that.
Yeah, I think that sense of shared meaning is really important because too often in M&A or when companies come together, there's either the mothership, as I'll call it, it's are trying to enforce their values, behaviors, and or culture down through the separate organizations, or
Yeah,
there's a bit of a bun fight between which organization has the best culture, and
yeah.
that being sort of tried to assimilate. Um,
Yeah, and I think one thing I just wanted to throw in there too is I think we often forget about like the sort of geographical cultural influences too, because that was one thing I was going to say with the sort of
mm,
the Asia experience. So, so I've mainly worked for US or North American tech organizations, um, but then been in different parts of the world. I'm based in mainland Europe.
mhm,
The idiosyncrasies of culture here in every European country are very different to in the UK, where I'm originally from, and very different then again with culture in Asia. So just to not, when you kind of lay it out like that, to not give it intention kind of feels
Yes.
crazy. Yeah, it's so complex, and so it needs some hand holding.
Yeah, and to that point, comms and language become super important.
Yeah.
I'm lucky enough to have worked with a large organization in Japan, and one of the things we talk a lot about in Northern Europe and in Western Europe and North America is the idea we use the words autonomy or disruption, and for many countries and many cultures, in Southeast Asia and Japan particularly, those words have very different overtones
Yeah.
attached to them, which aren't necessarily desirable. So I can see in the chat we've had the 5 minute warning which means we've got 15 minutes for questions, and there's questions in there. Kathy, I want to make sure that we're answering your question that you put in the chat. I just want to can you just expand on that a little bit for us, just so I can make sure that we're answering it? Or Helen, do you know?
Yeah, so lovely to see Kathy on here.
There we go.
Thank you for joining. Um, so 100%, can there be more fluidity too? I think that was in reference to the sort of 2 or 3 days a week hybrid policy with that sort of change. Um, and I think we're moving to a world where like 110% yes, and ideally we move away from. I mean, policy is something that people naturally, like all of us, we go, oh, like I think I want to push against it. It's a policy, so I think that organizations have quite some way to go, I think, to be able to get to a place where we can operationalize that fluidity. But I think we need more examples of it,
Hmm.
and we're starting to see them. And I know Kathy is working hard on surfacing more of those examples. But yeah, like finding ways of working that work for the organization and for the individuals that are building that organization, making it what it is, I believe is very possible, right? You can bring those two things together, but I think it does take more work than a lot of companies right now are prepared to put in. Um, it needs organizations like the U Collective to help them actually have those conversations and build process.
Well played, Helen. Well played. I'm smiling because I said I absolutely won't. We can't get into the return to office thing because that's one of my absolute massive passion topics. So I'm biting my tongue, and that could be very well a return conversation because we could definitely do a Mad 32 on that. Um, we did want to talk a little bit about the operationalizing. So Claire's put in a great question in the chat. So in your experience, what are the three critical strategic or operational practices, habits to have in place to bring about a desired culture?
Um, Yeah, I think that I'm leaning back, Claire, on the clarity, accountability, and comms because so maybe there's more we can build out in there. So from clarity, I mean like defining your purpose as an organization, and like you need everybody to feel bought into that. So keep going until it feels meaningful, and it might take quite some time. Um, I think that the accountability is like it's tiring, but it's true that it has to feel like leaders both have your back and can have those difficult conversations and hold others accountable. So that just how you make that happen is key. And maybe some of this is training, right? Like we expect a lot of leaders these days, and maybe we're not giving people enough support to lead and drive culture in a way that we expect. Back to that point of it's not just about people leaders and HR leaders. Maybe we actually need to train everybody in a leadership role in management to be able to lead that way. And yeah, we've talked about comms, so
Yeah,
keep
and
doing it.
I think the other thing I'd add to that is around the systems and processes that are based around your rewards and recognition, your recruitment, how you do your performance management. If you have values and they are the kind of the how you do your culture, all values need to have behavior. So values is the intention, behaviors is how you bring about that intention. It's, values in action, it's the actions. But underneath that, then you have a set of competencies. It's the old-fashioned grid which adds the kind of measurables to your values and behaviors. Because otherwise, like I said, leaders have a lot to think about. So they need to have clarity about, okay, what do those values and behaviors look like in action at each level? And then how, as an organization, are we rewarding, recognizing, measuring those? Because, as you know, Helen, what gets done or what gets valued is what's measured. So
Mm.
if we are saying that values and culture is important, then it has to be how we
Yeah.
reward people as well as just how they get, not just what they do, but how they get things done. If it's not part of that, then it can start to feel optional.
Yeah, and I think calling out those behaviors, um, it, 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 too often we have, and I've worked a lot in sales organizations, right? So we have, the loudest voice in the room closes the biggest deal. We hear from those people
Yeah, yeah.
uh, the most, and they are often kind of highlighted the most, right? Again and again, they've done this great thing. But how, and I'm not saying we shouldn't be highlighting those successes, but how are we also pulling out those behaviors that maybe are less obvious, but just as important for the organization to be successful and continue to be succeeding, right? The people that are involved in making that deal happen were not only that lead salesperson, and also those behaviors that are just quieter, right? Sometimes, but we need keep calling those out because otherwise, I think culture can start to move towards that loudest person in the room.
Yeah.
And yeah, we don't always want that.
And when we think about the modern workplace, tech obviously, it has a huge part to play in that. Are there elements of how tech within operationalizing or systems and process that can aid culture? And how can that be used?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I've been in the tech space for 20 years, and I think that there is definitely a place for it. Hey, but that combination is so important. Too often, I see organizations buying all the tech, right? And they just throw the tech at it and then hope that if we're talking about kind of tech around culture and comms, hope that that just catches it somehow. And of course, if you're going to roll any technology out, you need to have your purpose back to the clarity, like the vision of why you're doing this clear. What are we expected to use? For example, this chatbot that asks us questions about how we're doing today, right? Like, and is that actually helping us communicate better and feel safe, for example? Are these things the most important things, or is it just does it become a sort of nice to have and in the end get in the way? So
Does
yeah,
it become the replacement for the conversations and the interaction
exactly
that is
that.
the is
Yeah,
the is the meat of culture? Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Another great question from Scott here, and I think this really gets to heart a lot of this is we've talked a lot about comms and that culture is based on listening. It's about conversations, but in implementing change as you go through growth or implementing change as you're perhaps descaling or restructuring, at what point do you let me just read Scott's question. He puts it more articulately than I could do paraphrasing it. So, when trying to institute cultural change, when do you seek permission or forgiveness? And when does consultation end and implementation begin? Or should they both be intertwined?
Yeah, beautiful question. I'd love to hear more on your experience of this one, Scott, because it feels like it's kind of coming from something. Um, yeah, I think like the we can't do like endless conversation, of course not. At some point, change needs to happen. And I think like for me, this is back to that point of like we're all hopefully adults
Hmm.
that show up for work and we can expect certain things from our employees as they can expect certain things from us as leaders. And so, you know, there's a certain amount of just, we're going to have this conversation. We're going to keep the comms going. We're going to hold a safe space. But the change does have to happen. And people either need to get on board or not at some point. And so, yeah, I mean, I know I've been guilty as a leader of kind of holding people perhaps for too long, right? Like it became not good for them either. If they're also just kind of fighting, and at some point, it's a learning opportunity for them that change is going to happen and they've got to get on board now. Um, so yeah, I think those sort of boundaries as a leader of like, okay, we are open. We're going to keep the lines of communication open. We're going to make sure these moments are on the calendar. We're going to try and do the change champions. We attempt a lot of this stuff, but we also live in the real world, and we need our employees to understand what's going on, and then trust the leaders to take them through the change.
Yeah,
Trust
there's an
being
interesting
key in there.
because there's a challenge there, isn't it? Between at what point do you stop building consensus and and know that you've got to move, know that you've got to move on? And I guess part of that, and it comes back to your comms thing, is understanding the timelines involved. Which means if you're communicating
Yeah,
early, and this isn't to say that there aren't certain changes that may be forced upon or that come around a little quicker than you'd like, because of socioeconomic reasons, the economic environment. But trying to communicate as early as possible and setting out some form of roadmap, even if that roadmap might change,
yeah.
to allow the time for there to be input, but also there being deadlines for. And at this point, these are the points that we need to put into place.
Yeah, exactly. And there you're trying to lead with as much clarity as you have as a leader. Like you can only, do so much. There's only so much that's humanly possible. But I think I think this was in the blurb of the webinar, like you're trying to lead with humanity. You're doing the best that you can and you're communicating as much as you can. And if your team recognize that, I mean, I think there's a point at which we're talking about sometimes, and it's important to say, not having the right people, the people that aren't fitting with the culture,
Hmm.
they are continuing not to be on board, and the those behaviors over time do really erode culture for everyone else. So there is something really hard as a leader in identifying that moment, to your point, Anthony, about the roadmap,
Mm.
where certain behaviors just kind of can't continue anymore because they're having such a detrimental effect on the culture of that wider group, and you need the momentum to keep going for everybody. This is hard anyway. The change has got to happen. Um, we need people on board. There has to be a moment where that's clear.
Yeah, and I think it's a question coming from Sophie. How do you ensure that frontline colleagues get the change messages, change culture? Yeah, that's really important. And Sophie, if I can just add to that, you see it particularly in retail where you have people who are out on the hard line of being customer facing, or in public services. So culture is created in head office, or somewhere in a hub somewhere, and then cascaded out. So yeah, Sophie's right there. Work focused or field based roles. So how do you make sure culture operates at your extremities for those who maybe who aren't part of that office culture or that central culture?
Yeah, I mean, I
Great
think
question.
I'd love your perspective on that, Anthony, because mine's very kind of tech focused, and certainly there are extremities perhaps with like remote offices. But my experience has been there's yeah, it's different, right? We're mainly office based. We're sort of
Mhm.
similar styles of working, which can really help make sure that culture um is felt. But yeah, not. I love your perspective. I think you've probably got more to share with that one.
Yeah, my sort of there's a couple of aspects to that. Part of it is a comms thing, which making sure that people who are in field-based roles or out on the front line don't feel so far removed from the organisation that they're sort of solo and Scott mentioned subcultures. So that requires constant communication and it requires a cadence of communication. So it's not just we see someone from central office when there's an issue or at Christmas, yeah, or we're not just called back into the office for field-based roles, particularly. We're not just called back into the office, you know, twice a year to have our review with a line manager we've never seen. So how do you create a meaningful cadence that allows people to feel a meaningful part of that culture? Um, and again, it sort of refers back to making sure that your communications are fit for everyone that works in the organization and that you've got leaders and managers that are able to frame the conversation around your purpose, your values, your behaviors and competencies in a way that's relevant for the roles that
Mm.
you're applying it to. Um, and I think part of that cultural change is also, and this is partly we've chatted about this idea of hybrid working, full time return to office, and at the other extreme, totally remote. Some of it's a little bit about changing the mindset, which is sometimes field based roles feel. Full-time return to the office is that sense that we're owned by the company, so we have to come in. The other extreme is, remote based often feel
Yeah.
like a guest, right?
Yeah.
So they're lucky to have us, and oh, do I have to come in again? So I think there's something around tackling that early doors.
Yeah.
And whilst you might feel at the extremities of your organization, how can you keep people connected in a meaningful way? And that is two way. And there is also something around setting expectations around that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, Sophie, I hope that answers your question. Oh my God, it's 2 minutes. So, as we look to wrap this up, anything else that you think that you want to make sure people hear before we finish, Helen?
I mean, I think that headline for me is what we're talking about today is not something that should be owned by any one leader. This is, culture change. Change is something we're all going to experience. And so, leaders who can feel comfortable through change, or at least feel that they can have perhaps uncomfortable conversations through change, is just paramount, especially in today's world, right? We're constantly hit with change left, right, and center. And then ideally that we create an expectation within our organizations that that we can all have the conversation, that it's not top down, and this is back to psychological safety and creating those spaces where people can share what they need to share. But yeah, that it's okay. It starts with leaders that can have those conversations, but that we're creating a culture within our organizations that everybody can go through change together and share what they need to share.
And reminding ourselves that culture is a social contract, and every so often you have to revisit that contract to make sure that all the
Love
clauses,
that.
are still relevant. Helen, I know we could talk for ages, and there might be I think there might be a return one on this, perhaps on the return to office hybrid remote conversation, because that feels really rich. Everybody else who's out there in Tinternet around the world, thank you so much for joining today. If you have any questions whatsoever, or you'd like to follow up on any of these conversations, feel free to email me or email us, and we'll get back to you some answers. Of course, there you go. You can see where the U Collective, we're here to service all your people, culture, leadership needs. Any questions, let us know. Other than that, have a blessed and joyful rest of your day, and hope to see you all again soon. Take care.
Thanks, Anthony.
Ta-ra.